All right, so this next little lecture is going to be on kind of the background of public speaking, which is the art of rhetoric and how rhetoric informs this class, in particular how I approach teaching it and incorporating these ideas about rhetoric. And I feel very strongly about rhetoric. My graduate degree, my PhD, was in communication, focusing on rhetoric, in particular legal rhetoric. Same thing with my master's degree. My law degree was from Baylor, which is huge in just practical application of public speaking and persuasion. And so kind of rhetoric has been a really strong underpinning in my life. I really think that it is important, and these ancient theories have some things to teach us even now. So what do we mean by rhetoric? Because when we hear rhetoric, we often think of it as a negative or pejorative term, right? It's mere rhetoric. Or the candidate's rhetoric is blah, 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 but it's not something they're actually going to follow up with. That sort of conception of rhetoric has been with us for thousands of years, for millennia, but originally it was a discipline that was designed to teach people how to speak. So, and this goes all the way back to ancient Greece and the Western tradition, and certainly much further back in other traditions, which people are starting to study more now. There is some evidence that Plato, the philosopher Plato, was the first person to coin the term rhetoric. And how Plato thought of rhetoric was it was winning the soul through discourse. And the soul is kind of like the very essence of a person. And for Plato, he thought rhetoric was a good thing when it would move an audience to improving themselves, so something for the betterment of the soul. So winning the soul through discourse could be negative. You could get people to persuade people to do things that may not be good. Hitler is the classic example of this. But also you can persuade people to do good things. For example, you could persuade people to donate to some sort of a fundraising campaign on Kickstarter using discourse. So rhetoric is kind of this neutral thing that can be used for good and bad. And Plato himself went back and forth on whether rhetoric was good or bad. But to review, so Plato, it was winning the soul through discourse. A little bit later, the philosopher Aristotle said that rhetoric was the faculty of discovering in any given case the available means of persuasion. So he was, I kind of call this the Malcolm X school of rhetoric, where by any means necessary. So you go out, you do research on your audience, you find out what motivates them, what their concerns are, what their needs are, what their interests are, and you use whatever sort of technique that was going to work on that audience. And we're going to talk about some of those techniques and things, because Aristotle is one of the groundbreaking scholars in rhetorical theory. Much later, or a little bit later, is Quintilian. He was a Roman philosopher and actually an instructor, wrote a lot about education. He was after Aristotle, and he said that rhetoric is something that happens when a good person speaks well. And so the idea there, again, kind of back to Plato, is that a speaker should be a good person, and good in a moral sense, not good in like technically okay. Though that's important, it's not the most important thing. It's talking about a moral component of good. So it's a good person speaking well. That's when we've got rhetoric. Much later, John Locke, which is he's in the 18th century, I believe, he kind of, we see more of the modern idea about rhetoric is with him. He says rhetoric is a powerful instrument of error and deceit. And one thing about John Locke's time is people were trying to go much more towards a universal language and having words that had consistent, enduring meanings, regardless of culture or time period, because language can be used in so many different ways. And it's kind of like, I still have friends that are like this, who think that mathematics or arithmetic is really the kind of the most pure language, that anybody from around the world can communicate using mathematical symbols, and everybody else knows what they're talking about, right? They've got this set meaning that everybody's agreed on, and it's not like a greater than or equal to sign could mean one thing in Russia and Russian and a completely different thing in China and Chinese, right? It's all the same thing. And that's kind of what John Locke and his contemporaries were working for. So for him, certainly using language can be tricky. And so he says, this can really help trick people. Now, how I'm going to be using rhetoric is kind of based on these historical views, but it's a way to really get everybody on the same page, to kind of create a community that we want to live in using language. My nutshell kind of tweet definition of rhetoric is the efficient use of power. Right? Because if you're a leader, you could have police on every street corner trying to enforce the rules and the laws, or you could persuade people and use language so that they're constantly persuading themselves to follow the rules, and that's much more efficient than having to hire police and arm them and all that other sort of stuff. So for me, rhetoric is the efficient use of power, and power is a good thing. Or I guess it's kind of a amoral thing. It can be good or it can be bad depending on how it's used. Now, when I talk about rhetoric and public speaking, it's an art. It's not like it's a science where there's kind of inputs and outputs, and if you put in this particular code, this output will come out, if you've done the code right. That's not how public speaking works. It's not how communication works. Though many people wish it would work that way, it doesn't. And so there's kind of this element of you've got to try it and see how it works for you. And that's going to be something I may suggest to you often when you ask, well, what is the rule here? What should I do in this case? It's like, well, it depends. So rhetoric is an art. Public speaking is going to be an art. And so, like a lot of other arts, we're going to acquire the skill of public speaking through 3 ways. Those 3 ways are instruction, imitation, and practice. Okay, so instruction are things that I'm going to provide, the videos are going to provide, the text is going to provide, and the links that I'm going to provide on web access will also provide. This is going to give you some of the pointers, the theory behind things, and that's going to be one part of it. But of course, just like with golf, you can't learn about a golf course and kind of the physics of the ball and the club and then say, okay, now I'm a golfer, right? You've got to actually go out there, pick up the clubs, and hit the ball. And it's the same thing with speaking. So it's not just instruction, though instruction is a key part. There's also an element of imitation. Now, imitation does not mean plagiarizing. It doesn't mean taking somebody else's text and then just using it word for word, or paraphrasing it and not giving them appropriate citation. Instead, imitation means finding those people who you think are good speakers, seeing what it is that they do that you think is so good, and then trying to incorporate certain elements of that into your own speaking style. Because there's some things that Steve Jobs was very well known for being a great dynamic speaker, one who learned how to become a great speaker. And you can't just simply go out and do what Steve Jobs does, because it may not work for you. So you're going to have to find these elements, like perhaps the fact that Steve Jobs was such a showman and kept his visual aids hidden until the very moment that he wanted to show them. It's like, that's really good, that works great, I'm going to use that in my speech. That's the kind of thing that we're talking about with imitation. So it's finding elements of good speakers, things that they do, and you're like, that's awesome, I want to do that. And you work that into your own presentation to see if it fits, right? Now, the last part, because even if you've gotten the instruction and you've watched a lot of good speakers, and you're like, oh my God, this is great, this is awesome, Neil deGrasse Tyson, he's just so dynamic and how he presents kind of boring things like science. You've still got to actually do the practice. You can't, and students try to do this, they say, man, I didn't have time to practice, so I came in and I winged it. Sometimes people can do an okay job just winging it. They can do that okay job because they've done speaking a lot in the past. So they're not just winging it. They're pulling from years of previous practice. Right? It's what professors do when they teach. They kind of, each lecture may change a little bit in topic and delivery from class to class, but they're not winging it in the sense that they've done no practice. They've done years of practice beforehand. So you need to practice your speech. You need to practice it in front of a live audience so you get ears other than your own listening to it, because then they're going to be able to pull things out and identify problems that a real audience is going to have, not just you. So you have got to have that instruction. You are going to hammer out the skill of public speaking against the anvil of practice, and there's no way to avoid doing that. Let's see. Oh, the last thing that I want to talk about that comes from rhetoric are what's called the canons of rhetoric, and those are C-A-N-O-N-S. And you can find this in the textbook too. And the canons of rhetoric were introduced to me as the functional activities of rhetoric. So these are the things that you do as a rhetorician that help with creating a speech. And there are 5 of them. And I'll give them to you in English and in Latin. The first one is invention or inventio. And invention is discovering what it is that you're going to say. It's everything from going back to thinking, what is my speaking situation? What's my task? What do I have to do? Who is my audience? How long do I have? Where am I going to be presenting this? All kind of these things that you need to ask yourself and to find out before you even think about the speech. Then it's also thinking about, well, what's my topic going to be? What's my thesis? What's my purpose? What's my goal in this speech? What do I want to have at the end of the speech? Who is my audience? What are their desired outcomes? Kind of what are they looking for in this speech? Well, what can I help them with? It's also going out to do research. You may have some idea about a topic, but maybe you don't know the details. Maybe you don't know when something started, so you've got to go and do some research for that. So kind of these are all the elements of invention. It's discovering what it is that you're going to say. And at this time, historically, invention was thought about as a little differently than we think of it now. Now we think of invention as discovering brand new things. And for rhetoricians, invention was discovering things that were already there. So that's invention. The second canon of rhetoric is arrangement or dispositio, like disposition without the N at the end. So arrangement is, now that you've got all the stuff that you're going to say, what sort of structure are you going to use? How are you going to organize your speech so that it is concise, it's clear, and it's accessible by the audience? Because the only way that the audience gets that information is through you. You are the conduit of that information. So you need to think about how you can structure your speech so that it makes sense to the audience. And that means everything from the intro, body, conclusion, but it also means things like, okay, well, what are the elements of the introduction that I need to have? What are the elements of the body that I should have? And what are the elements of the conclusion that I should have? And in the body, well, do I want to organize this according to time in a chronological order, like give the history of the College of San Mateo starting when it was first talked about? Or do I want to talk about the College of San Mateo as a physical location, as a campus, in which case I might want to do a spatial structure. And my decisions about the order of the parts of the body are going to be based on what my goal is and who my audience is and what my topic is. And we're going to talk about some specific structural things with the impromptu speech in a different video and in class. So those are the first two, invention and arrangement. The third is style. And style is language. Style is language. So style is, how are you going to talk about this? What sort of language are you going to use? And this is going to depend a lot on contextual cues, who your audience is, where you're speaking, and kind of, time period in which you're speaking. So you want to make sure that your speech and the information you're talking about is clear and accessible and correct for your audience. With classical rhetorical theory, there were 3 levels of style. It was the grand, the middle, and the plain. And the grand is like high elevated language. The middle is the kind of language that you would use every day, and the plain would be language that you might use if you're a dock worker, or you're working on a boat or something, or you're hanging out with your friends, a lot of slang, perhaps a few curse words, etc. So historically, they kind of thought about them as levels, which can be a nice way to think about it, but you don't necessarily have to be locked into thinking about levels. So those are the first three parts: invention, arrangement, style. Then there is memory. Memory, which is in Latin was memoria. So memory is important even now because you've got to remember what it is that you're going to say. You'll notice that I am not using, or I'm using very minimal notes. And most of the time I'm kind of making eye contact with you via the camera. So as a speaker, you want to make sure that you have practiced your speech enough so that you can remember the main points. You know which section you're going to from one part to the next, because you don't want to just read your speech. And we'll talk about that when we talk about some aspects of delivery. But memory is important for you because you want to deliver your speech in an extemporaneous manner. That means you've done the preparation, you've practiced, and you've got minimal notes, like one note card. Memory is also important for the audience because the whole point about speaking is to make a connection with the audience, right? You have a goal that you're trying to get done. You also are considerate of the audience's desired outcomes, what they're looking for in the speech at the end of it. And so you've got to think about, how can I construct this speech? How can I communicate this speech in a way where the audience is going to remember it? I mean, if you're giving somebody directions somewhere, it's pointless if 2 seconds after you're done giving the directions, the audience has forgotten how to get there, right? So you've got to think about memory not only for you as a speaker, but also for the audience so that they can remember the key elements of your message. So those are the 5 canons: invention, arrangement, style, memory. The last one is delivery, or in Latin it was actio. Delivery is how you're actually presenting the speech. Are you doing it face-to-face, like you will be doing for your major speeches? Is it going to be via camera, like it is, like I'm doing here? And if it's through a camera, is it going to be kind of a live presentation, or is it going to be taped and people can watch it at their leisure? Or is it going to be just audio, or is it also going to be video? Is it going to be, you're going to have a transcript also, or not? So these are kind of all some elements of delivery. Then you also have to think about visual aids. How do I want to support and enhance my message with the use of visual aids? Elements of dress, face, gestures, voice, eye contact, all the stuff we are going to talk about in much more detail. So those are the key things about rhetoric. These are important concepts, not just because I like to study them, but also because they are going to be on the quizzes and they're going to be in the test. So let me just make sure I've done everything that I want to talk about. And that is it. So I will see you guys in class.